Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Say their names. We at Letters to Strangers want to make it clear. Black lives matter always. Recent events have once again pushed to the forefront the heart-twisting reality of police brutality in the United States, particularly against Black and brown communities. We are an international organization, but we were founded and are based in the US. And frankly, racial equity is a human endeavor. So around the world, we support and will always stand with our Black siblings. We hear you, we feel you, and we are here marching alongside you. In this video, I'm going to talk about how Black identities can have an impact on mental health, particularly for young people. I'll give a brief overview about how racism persists in the United States, highlight specific challenges that Black youths face, and finally go over some suggestions and resources that can be used to tackle mental health issues. And I am super excited to introduce our guest speaker, Larry Jayoba. Yay! Hello, welcome to this video. Oh, this is the intro. There are 47 million Black Americans in the US, or roughly 14% of the population. Together, they've created and mastered some of the most iconic forms of expression. Jazz, hip-hop, breakdancing, science, medicine and technology, soul food, competitive sports, poetry, and of freaking course, civil rights. But despite all that, Black Americans have dealt with racism and exploitation in American society since before the USA was the USA. So, to no one's surprise, this can come with some serious mental health impacts. Black Americans should be celebrated, not just for their contributions to our lives, but for being them, for surviving, for existing, for simply being fellow human beings. Overall, African Americans are 20% more likely to experience a mental health condition than the US population as a whole. That's not because of any inherent fault with being Black, but more because of factors like institutionalized racism, aka racism that is deeply embedded within society's systems and structures. It could look like discrimination in healthcare, education, housing, and employment, among other things, fueled by America's long history of racism and segregation. So whether it be increased exposure to air pollution and lead poisoning, or reduced access to high-quality healthcare, the impacts of institutionalized racism on Black communities affect every area of life. And after a while, it understandably takes a toll. So as we talk about mental health, remember that the statistics aren't just because someone is Black, but because numerous risk factors, such as homelessness or exposure to violence and poverty, these things target African Americans disproportionately. Now, disproportionately is a word that's going to be used a lot in this video. So just to illustrate what we mean by that, when something is disproportionate, right, it basically means that it's too big or too small compared to what we'd expect. Let's say you have a coin. There's a 50-50 chance of getting heads or tails. So you flip the coin over and over again, 1,000,000 times even. Maybe a computer does this for you. But funnily enough, you almost never flip tails. You might say that you flipped a disproportionate number of heads. Now, that means something is up with the coin or how you're flipping it. Well, in this case, that coin is America. And the results you're getting is what Black individuals experience as institutionalized racism. Racism, ironically, doesn't discriminate in the sense that it doesn't care if you were born in the US or just recently migrated here. This means that even though African immigrants have their own sets of challenges compared to the US-born Black Americans, to the system, they look the same. But there are differences, and those differences matter. Time for history. Africans have been in the US since the first slave ship arrived in 1619. As a result, for generations, most Black people in the US were descendants of slaves and born here on American soil. It was only after a series of immigration laws, particularly in 1965, that Caribbean, African, and African diasporic foreigners were allowed to emigrate here. So between 2000 and 2016 alone, the number of African immigrants in the US more than doubled. Now about 1 in 10 Black Americans are foreign-born. And if you add in the second generation, the children of immigrants, then 18% of the American Black population have recent immigration in their background. On average, compared to US-born Black people, Black immigrants are older, less likely to live in poverty, and have higher household incomes, mostly because that was necessary to even get past the legal system in the first place. That means in some ways, by being able to emigrate here, their exposure to risk factors for mental illness is a bit different than that of the US-born African Americans. Over time, though, some of that difference fades away. Like other minorities, immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean seem to face greater risks of mental illness the longer they stay in the United States. This is just one example of the immigrant health paradox, which basically states that recent immigrants often have better health outcomes than families who emigrated here generations ago. Now, it's hard to say why exactly this is the case, but exposure to institutionalized racism on a national scale probably has something to do with it. So let's look at racism. There's a lot, and I mean a lot, to this issue. So we encourage you to search up other videos and resources to learn more about the many ways that racism exists in the US. We have some links and suggestions down in the description below. For now, though, I'll go over some historical and modern issues that are particularly relevant for African American mental health, namely the criminal justice system and the wealth gap. If you went to an American school, you've probably heard this in history class. After the Civil War was won, slavery was finally outlawed with the 13th Amendment. But is that really true? Not exactly. The 13th Amendment has an exception: slavery for punishment of a crime. So if someone commits a crime and they get imprisoned, they can be forced to work for nothing or just a few cents per hour, prison labor. And if our legal courts target African Americans disproportionately, then more African Americans will end up in prison and therefore, right. The US is the world leader in incarceration. Between 1985 and 2017, the number of people detained in US prisons and jails increased by a whopping 500%. Due to racial profiling, the burden of imprisonment falls disproportionately on Black and brown communities. What does this look like? Well, if we take a look at the rate of imprisonment from 2017, Black men were imprisoned at a rate almost 6 times higher than white men, and Black women were imprisoned at a rate roughly twice that of white women. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not because Black individuals are just inherently more violent or more likely to be criminals than white people. It's more a consequence of racial profiling, or the targeting of people based on racist stereotypes and systems. The murders of Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, and Eric Garner are just a few examples of how the criminal justice system disproportionately hurts Black people. Because of all this, African Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to have an incarcerated family member at some point during their childhood. This can mean missing out on key role models who can offer guidance or support. Not to mention, contact with the prison system can increase a person's risk of experiencing housing instability, homelessness, and healthcare insecurity. Young Black Americans are also directly targeted through what we call the school-to-prison pipeline. Here, school policies and practices disproportionately punish children and teens from minority backgrounds, which ends up with them often sent to the juvenile prison system. How does that happen? Well, 14 million students in the US are in schools with police to maintain discipline, but have no counselors, nurses, psychologists, or even social workers. So with that, you get statistics like how 15% of public school students are Black, but they make up 31% of the students arrested or referred to law enforcement. And you can imagine that if a young person ends up at a juvenile detention center, aka juvie, they aren't going to get any proper education or support. Basically, Black children or teens are far more likely to be punished, and more harshly so, than their white peers for the same behavior. Through this school-to-prison pipeline, they are pushed into being seen as criminals. And there's no reverse pipeline either. Most of them will not graduate from high school. According to one MIT study, compared to other young people, incarcerated youths are about 40% more likely to be in jail again before they're 25. And the psychological and economic consequences of that are huge. But you don't need to be convicted in court to be hurt by the criminal justice system. Enter police brutality. Like the previous factors we've discussed, African Americans historically and currently are disproportionately exposed to violence, which means the police often get brought in. And fear of police brutality is very real for many people in the community. In 2019, African Americans were 2.5 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by the police. And that reality contributes to racial trauma, which is basically the impact that racism has on a person's mental and physical health. Simply said, this sort of psychological burden can show up as symptoms of anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Such intense and persistent fear can lead to mental illness. This can be especially distressing during the digital age that we live in today. Recently, videos depicting violence against African Americans have received a lot of attention, especially on social media. It's important to consider how these videos can affect Black viewers, because while videos can spur dialogue surrounding racial injustice, it can also be incredibly painful to see your trauma dissected and critiqued on the news or social media by people you don't even know. Not to mention how frustrating it may be to see people outside of your community finally waking up to your lived reality. And a lot of the time, unplugging from the internet isn't really an option. So what do you do if you come across disturbing content in your feed? One thing you can do about videos on Twitter, for example, is to disable autoplay or adjust your safety settings. Everyone processes these things differently, so what's important here is your well-being and hopefully finding something that works best for you. So, side note, for anyone who posts on social media, please consider how sharing violent content can impact your friends online. We're here to look out for each other. And looking out for each other isn't just about videos of police brutality or news articles on the murders of Black Americans. The way that these atrocities and the criminal justice system impact the African American community is important. But the thing is, you don't even need to interact with the system at all to be impacted by systemic racism. Racism is more insidious than that. And the way it targets generations of families the most is through socioeconomics. One example of this is wealth. Wealth is essentially the net worth of a family. A home, savings account, stocks. Having wealth is a sign of financial security. It makes it possible to get an education, start a new business, buy a new house, or move to a different neighborhood to pursue better opportunities. But in the US, wealth is unequally distributed by race. Even if we account for factors such as education level, African Americans have just a fraction of the wealth that white Americans have. This is what we call the wealth gap. What's happening here? Well, for starters, African American families are basically starting 300 years behind white families. Wealth makes more wealth. White families have been growing and passing down wealth for generations. African American families, on the other hand, couldn't participate. Take home ownership, right? Like in the 1930s, the New Deal provided mortgage aid, which is basically help in buying a house. But mortgages were not given for houses in quote-unquote risky areas. Now, how did they decide what was risky? Surprise. By race. The government literally drew lines around communities that were deemed hazardous or declining to separate them from communities deemed desirable and best, aka redlining. This process divided neighborhoods based on socioeconomic status, which exploited the fact that African Americans had little to no opportunities compared to whites due to sharecropping and the Jim Crow laws of the late 1800s. Essentially, practices that reinforced the oppression of slavery under new names and systems. What was the impact? Neighborhoods where African Americans lived were under-prioritized, segregated, and resource poor. Race-based housing discrimination ended in 1968, But more subtle forms of discrimination still continue today, with exclusionary zoning and gentrification. The point here is that Black families have been pushed to live in neighborhoods with far fewer resources and opportunities. And those impacts pile up over time. Aside from the wealth gap, income inequality is also a thing. Compared to white Americans, African Americans face higher unemployment rates and often end up working lower paying jobs with fewer benefits, like health insurance or retirement planning. And a lot of the time, the better jobs out there require a college degree. Because of various financial barriers, African Americans are less likely to be able to afford college. But even between African Americans and white Americans with a college degree, African Americans still face higher job instability and unemployment. Hiring discrimination can play a huge role here. In one experiment, researchers sent identical resumes with either white-sounding or African-American-sounding names to employers and measured how often each applicant was offered an interview. The applicants with white-sounding names were offered an interview 50% more often than applicants with African-American-sounding names, even though all applicants were equally qualified for the job. And in the past 25 years, hiring discrimination hasn't really declined much. This can be a huge barrier to finding a stable and well-paying job. So to summarize, many Black families don't have financial security and wealth the same way that white families do, and they continue to be blocked from attaining so. Historically, Black neighborhoods are usually underfunded and underinvested. And being in an underdeveloped neighborhood can increase your exposure to risk of poverty, homelessness, and violence. All of this affects your education, safety, jobs, real estate, and other opportunities, which, at the end of the day, combine to impact your mental health. As you can imagine, this sort of trauma and pain builds up over time. That means it can be passed down too, in what is called intergenerational trauma. The body has this biological memory of stressful conditions and other harmful experiences, which can alter the way that your genes express themselves. So if your ancestors experienced trauma, it could affect your mental well-being generations down the line. This means that even if you right now are not experiencing the same level of trauma, your body can still react to passed down triggers in stressful fight or flight ways. That being said, it's important to note here that your ancestors' trauma doesn't mean you are bound to have a mental illness. But it does mean that seeking help might be more important for you than for others. Okay, but sometimes seeking help can feel really, really hard. There's this need that many African Americans feel to be strong. And given all that they have experienced, that isn't so surprising. And while strength is certainly commendable, this expectation can be damaging. For African American boys and men, the need to be strong might look like hypermasculinity, or the idea that suffering is somehow a form of strength. You're the tough one, you're a real man, you can endure anything. For African American girls and women, being strong means being the mother who dedicates everything to nurture her children, to help out her family, to be that voice, being the strong Black woman who can do it all. But trying to do it all can take a serious toll on your health, and sometimes other people mistake you as being the angry Black woman. So being strong is admirable, but it's not realistic or sustainable to expect superhuman abilities of yourself. We're only human, and it's normal to feel exhausted or overwhelmed. Like other communities, African Americans also experience stigma around mental illness. This can be partly explained by expectations, like that need to be strong. One study found that 63% of African American participants saw depression as a personal weakness. 30% said they would just deal with it by themselves. Only 1/3 of the participants said that they would accept medication for depression from a medical professional. And stigma surrounding mental illness can be very real for immigrants too, especially when it comes to things like depression. Talking about depression might put a person at risk of becoming an outcast in their own community, or at least they might fear that. Adults and peers might refuse to recognize mental distress as an actual health condition, or just see it as something that's more spiritual rather than biomedical. Given the other pressures that immigrants already face, like navigating housing, healthcare, and education, and adjusting to the racial discrimination here in the US, it's scary to feel like you might be ignored by your own support system, by your own support network. It's not surprising then that many immigrants opt out of receiving formal treatment for mental illness, even when they could benefit a lot from it. But what exactly is the impact of stigma on your mental health? Well, for one, you might be hesitant to seek support, but it also might influence how you experience mental illness in the first place. More so than white Americans, African Americans and African immigrants experience somatization, which is basically the physical signs of psychological distress. It's like your body is physically sending you a signal, like, hello, we are not doing well right now, please pay attention. This can cause some pretty wacky symptoms, like unexplained headaches or back pain, or it might cause a person to collapse and fall asleep. What's going on here, and what does stigma have to do with it? Well, in communities where mental illness is stigmatized, it can often be more socially acceptable to seek help for physical pain rather than mental pain. And because of this, our bodies might resort to physical expressions of pain in response to the mental distresses that we experience. So it's important to keep an eye out for these sort of unexplained symptoms and check in on how you're feeling, both mentally and physically. Pay attention to things like how you're sleeping, how you're eating, how you're interacting with the people you love. If you can connect a physical symptom that seems out of the ordinary for you with how you are feeling mentally, that can be a sign to seek support. That can be really helpful too when you're trying to have those scary conversations with your family and your peers about mental health. By telling them about your physical symptoms and distress as well, you might be able to show them that you are legitimately struggling, even though, of course, you shouldn't have to struggle physically just to be taken seriously. Now you're aware of some of the signs to look out for. Let's say you've identified that you are not feeling well and you want to get help. How do you go about this if your support network is skeptical of treatment? Well, let's first unpack where this sort of skepticism of the healthcare system might come from. One of the key arguments against seeking mental health care in the African American community is a profound mistrust of the system, and frankly, for understandable reasons. African Americans have been historically experimented on and exploited by the American healthcare system. One example is the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment. From 1932 until 1972, 600 African American men were falsely told that they were being treated for the disease. They were actively prevented from using penicillin, a life-saving antibiotic, long after it had already been used to treat syphilis. Why? The study wanted to see how syphilis can affect people, essentially using these men as lab rats. Fear of provider bias can also understandably lead to some mistrust. The term provider bias basically describes the assumptions that healthcare providers may have about their patients based on their ethnicity or gender and other factors. And these assumptions, while often unconscious or unintended, can impact the quality of patient care. This isn't to say that all doctors are racist. But it is well documented that there is a difference between the quality of treatment that African American patients receive compared to that of white patients. Given this disparity, it's not surprising that a higher percentage of African Americans report fear of mental health treatment than their white counterparts. And Black immigrants face their own challenges when it comes to engaging with the American healthcare system as well. For starters, American healthcare is expensive, and it can be difficult to navigate even for people born in the US. Getting proper care can be especially hard if your healthcare provider isn't aware of how your culture and background influence your specific needs. This is what we call cultural incompetency, and it can be a huge barrier to getting the treatment that is right for you. While delaying treatment might seem like the safest option given the stigma and exploitative healthcare experiences of African Americans, it's usually not the best long-term solution. African Americans often cut off treatment early or avoiding seeking medical care if at all possible. So this means that when treatment is sought out, it's usually because the situation has become severe. Because of this, African Americans are more likely to receive emergency services than white Americans, which is where more problems than solutions pop up. Think about this. How do you respond to a mental health emergency? Well, oftentimes we're told the answer is the police, but interacting with the police can be downright frightening. The good news is that many counties in the US are creating crisis response teams, or CRT, with trained mental health professionals and personnel to make crises safer for everyone involved. It's also helpful to know that when you call 911, a health problem will probably bring the fire department, while a safety problem will probably bring the cops. So it could be helpful to explain your specific type of emergency if you do need to call 911, and request a CRT member if at all possible. If crisis teams aren't available where you are, there usually are hotlines and emergency services that could be in your region, and those can be helpful as well. But scenarios like that aren't the everyday experience. What if there is no crisis? What happens when there's just a young Black person who wants help and support for their mental health concerns? Here's the dilemma. How do you engage with a system that is actively oppressing you? That's a difficult question to answer. And there isn't really any one answer out there for everyone. But there are some things that we can tell you about the healing process that might be useful. First, remember that you are deserving of healing and feeling well. Give yourself permission to care for your mental health. Tap into your community and listen and be there for each other. One perfect example comes right from Illyri.
Hi everybody, my name is Illyri Jayoba. I am a first-generation Nigerian American, and I identify as a prison abolitionist, and I call myself a Black cooperativist because I believe in values such as cooperativism, collectivism, and solidarity economy. Abolition, by its very definition, means putting an end to a system or institution. And the system and institution that I really am hoping and fighting to put an end to is that of prisons and policing. So many other people have been historically in this fight and have paved the way for us to imagine a new world of being without prison and policing, and I decided to join that movement. I believe that prisons and policing stem from colonialism, historical anti-Blackness, and the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. I believe that there's such heavy roots of anti-Blackness in prisons and policing, and I think that transgenerational trauma is a very real thing when we think about historical anti-Blackness and how that passes through to from our ancestors to their descendants. I know personally my ancestors were slaves in Brazil, and one of my ancestors was able to come back to Nigeria and start a new free life there, but the trauma still passes down. Nigeria was colonized by the British. That still passes down, and my parents lived in South Africa during apartheid. That passed down to me. I now face racism in the U.S. and police brutality here. People in my community face that, and I face anti-Blackness head-on here. And I think something that has been so beautiful in trying to fight for a world in which no prisons exist is having solidarity in community, where I can replenish myself, be myself, enjoy my Blackness, be in my Blackness, and fight to imagine a new world where I can be healthy, enjoy my Blackness, and be me, and be liberated. So let's all come together, all colors, and be in this solidarity where we fight towards imagining a new world where everyone is valued and everyone's life matters. I know my life already matters, and I think it's important that we all value each other's lives.
Thank you so much. So to piggyback off of Illyri, let's talk about some other aspects of healing that might be helpful. With over 80% of African Americans identifying as religious, the church, especially the Black church, can serve as a powerful first resource and support network. Prayer, singing, and gathering are all factors that can contribute to your healing. I know that's a little bit difficult to do right now with COVID-19, but keep this in mind for the future. Pastors aren't always trained in mental health, but more churches are opening up counseling centers with trained pastoral psychologists. These can be safe spaces to open up as a sort of first line of defense. family can also help you as well. Historically and currently, the strong social networks of many African American families have indeed protected people with coping skills and strategies for resilience and beyond. Compared to elderly white Americans, elderly African Americans are more likely to live independently or with their extended family instead of a nursing home. What is the impact of this? Well, these family members can be powerful role models and offer wisdom and support during difficult times. In fact, we've seen that African American suicides are actually lower in the South in terms of rates and numbers than in the North and Western US, since family networks and sense of identity are generally stronger in the Black community in the southern states. Now, if you live in an East Coast city away from your extended family, that doesn't mean that you lose your support network. But it does mean that you might need to do more to actively seek out community. The point is, wherever you move, it's worth your time to seek out meaningful relationships. And you can do this by attending church gatherings or group therapy, taking classes you enjoy, participating in community groups, and you can stay connected with your extended family too. Small things like calling a family member each week or attending family gatherings when you have the chance. These can all make a world of difference when combined together over time. This might be a little bit more difficult for immigrants whose families are an ocean away, but it's hopefully not impossible. Depending on the cultures and traditions of your home, you might have family members who suggest forms of traditional healing, which, disclaimer, sometimes can be a holistic source of care that provides a sense of wellness and belonging, especially if combined safely and strategically with Western styles of psychiatric treatment. Basically, carefully consider where you are right now in your mental health journey. Know that it's different for everyone and think about who can best support you. These supporters could be from within your own community right now, or it could be someone totally different. But the point is to find and build that community and to remember that sometimes that could start with your own family. But of course, sometimes families and communities just aren't enough. Or maybe they're the problem in the first place. So it's just like when your body gets sick, or your mind isn't well, you might need to go seek professional help. It's important that your provider in those cases understands your identity so that they can give you the sort of care that matches your needs best. What we're looking for here is basically what's called cultural competence. So questions like, does my provider understand me? Can they communicate well with me and make me feel safe and heard? Here are some questions that you can ask when you're looking for a culturally competent provider. But don't let this be all the questions you ask or the limit to your journey with them. At the end of the day, being African American or a Black immigrant in the US comes with its own set of struggles and rewards. You might be accustomed to the phrase, what goes on in this house stays in this house. You might be told that mental illness is just a white people thing. But I hope you can see that caring about your mental health is legitimate. It's valid, and that you're able to give yourself permission to seek help. Be proud of yourself, because you're human, and you matter, and that is a truth that no one can take away from you, ever.